Welcome, you've arrived at my channel where every whisper holds a secret and every silence screams in the dark. Tonight, you're not just a listener, but a witness. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the darkness speak.
The White Doll's Curse, a Halloween nightmare. On a frigid Halloween night in 1993, as I spilled my trick-or-treat haul across the kitchen table, my mother's piercing scream cut through the air. A small white cloth doll, stitched from tattered rags, lay nestled among the candy, its eerie presence a chilling echo of a missing girl from 30 years ago, a relic of a predator who had once stalked our town. My heart pounded as Mom's hands shook violently, her voice rising in a frantic wail, demanding, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Mom came over to divide up the spoils and took one look through my candy, and then immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Her eyes wide with a terror that rooted me to the spot. I was just 9 years old, my face smeared with cheap skeleton makeup, my body draped in a torn trash bag masquerading as a costume, oblivious to the danger lurking in that innocent-looking doll. The memory of that night still haunts me. The way the doll's stitched eyes seemed to follow me, the way its fabric felt cold and heavy in my hands when Mom snatched it away. She dialed 911, her voice trembling as she declared it an emergency, and within hours, our quiet neighborhood transformed into a battleground of flashing lights and whispered fears. That doll wasn't just a prank. It was a ghost from the past, a link to a child snatched from her bed after receiving the same gift, a mystery that had never been solved and now threatened to pull me into its dark embrace. The day had started, with excitement, not dread. I'd been terrified of Halloween at first. The idea of miniature monsters roaming the streets had kept me clinging to my mother's skirt, my imagination conjuring ghouls from every shadow. But my 13-year-old brother, Jake, convinced me to join him and his middle school friends, promising a haul of candy that would make my fears melt away. Mom whipped up a last-minute costume with leftover monster makeup, painting my face like a skeleton, and I donned a ripped trash bag, dubbing myself a garbage ghoul. I must have looked ridiculous next to Jake's slick Batman costume and his friends' superhero get-ups, but I didn't care. All I wanted was my share of the sweets. Jake, ever the reluctant babysitter, agreed to escort me. And as we set out, the crisp autumn air filled with laughter and the rustle of costumes, my fears began to fade. Knocking on doors, shouting trick or treat, and collecting handfuls of chocolate and gum became the most fun I'd ever had, a thrill that drowned out the monsters in my mind. The neighborhood buzzed with generosity. One house, the town, dentists, handed us toothbrushes with a grin, laughing at our disappointed faces before tossing in real candy, a clever twist that had us giggling. Another gave us miniature Charlie Brown comic books, a quirky addition to our bags. But it was at a dimly lit house near the edge of town that the night took a turn. A man, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, opened the door and dropped something small and white into my bag with a cryptic smile, before vanishing inside. I didn't think much of it then. Halloween felt like a spookier Christmas, a night of surprises. But that innocent act would unravel everything. By the time Jake and I trudged home, our bags heavy with loot, I was buzzing with excitement, already planning to savor every piece. Mom's plan to ration our candy, stashing 3/4 away to avoid a sugar overdose, seemed like a minor annoyance, until she saw the doll. Her scream was a siren, a warning that pierced the cozy warmth of our kitchen, turning a night of joy into one of dread. Mom's reaction was unlike anything I'd seen. Her usual calm demeanor shattered as she demanded I recall every detail of who had given me the doll. I cried, overwhelmed by her intensity, my memory blank on the man's face, his hat casting too deep a shadow. The police arrived, their questions sharp and urgent, turning our home into a crime scene as they bagged the doll for evidence. The town buzzed with rumors, linking the doll to a 1963 case where a girl vanished after receiving one. Her abductor a drifter who'd slipped away. My mother's fear wasn't just for me. It was for a past she'd lived through. A shadow that had returned to haunt us all. The weight of that doll lingered in the air, a silent threat that turned every trick-or-treat memory into a nightmare I couldn't shake. The doll's presence in our kitchen lingered like a ghost. Its white fabric a stark contrast to the colorful candy scattered across the table, each stitch a reminder of the missing girl whose fate mirrored a terror my mother couldn't escape. As the police swarmed our house, taking statements and photographing the scene, I sat huddled on the couch, tears streaming down my painted face, the skeleton makeup smearing into a grotesque mask of my fear. Mom explained the history in hushed tones to the officers, a tale of a little girl not much older than I was then, who'd gone trick-or-treating 30 years ago and returned with a doll just like mine. Days later, she'd vanished from her bed, her mother finding only silence where laughter once rang. The man who'd given her the doll, a shadowy figure in a long coat, had been spotted at a park, smelling her hand before fleeing when confronted. No body, no clues, just a town left to wonder if he'd eaten her alive as the local kids whispered in their ghost stories. Now, that same fear gripped my mother, her hands clutching mine as she begged me to remember the man who'd dropped the doll into my bag. The investigation escalated quickly. Our quiet neighborhood, usually alive with the rustle of leaves and children's laughter, became a fortress of patrol cars and anxious parents. No child was allowed outside alone, schools buzzed with warnings, and the police issued an APB for a man matching the old description, tall, wearing a hat and scarf, his face obscured. They theorized it might be a copycat, someone inspired by the 1963 case. But the lack of immediate action left a gnawing doubt. Mum stayed by my side, her eyes scanning every shadow, her phone glued to her ear as she coordinated with neighbors. Jake, usually so carefree, paced the house, his Batman cape dragging on the floor, muttering about how we should have stayed home. The doll, now sealed in an evidence bag, sat on our counter like a ticking bomb, its presence a constant reminder of the danger that might still lurk outside. Days passed in a blur of tension. The police searched the town, questioning residents and reviewing old records, but no suspect emerged. The dentist who'd given us toothbrushes offered a grim smile, admitting he'd seen a stranger near his house that night, but couldn't describe him clearly. The Charlie Brown comic house reported nothing unusual, leaving the man with the hat as our only lead. Mom's friend, Mrs. Henderson, recalled the 1963 case vividly. Her own daughter had been friends with the missing girl, and she joined the effort, organizing a neighborhood watch. I spent those days indoors, my candy untouched, the thrill of Halloween replaced by a dread that clung to me like damp fog. The police eventually concluded it was likely a prank, a teenager mimicking the old legend, deterred by their heavy presence from escalating further. But the doubt lingered. Had I narrowly escaped a predator, or was my imagination feeding on my mother's fear? My nights were haunted by visions of that doll, its stitched face morphing into the missing girl's, her eyes pleading from the darkness of my room. I began to piece together fragments of that night. The man's hat, his quick retreat, the weight of the doll in my bag. Mom tried to shield me, but her own trauma surfaced, stories of her childhood fear of that same boogeyman spilling out in quiet moments. The town moved on, but the scar remained, a whisper of what might have been. I wasn't the only one to receive a doll that year. 2 other kids reported similar finds, but no abductions followed, a mercy we clung to. The police closed the case, chalking it up to a copycat's mischief, but Mom never fully recovered, her trust in Halloween shattered. The white doll, now a relic in a police evidence locker, became a symbol of the terror that had gripped our home, its presence a constant echo of the missing girl whose fate remained a mystery, a wound that refused to heal in my mother's heart. As the lockdown lifted, life resumed, but the air felt different, thicker with unspoken fears, as if the town held its breath, waiting for the man in the hat to return. I returned to school, my skeleton makeup washed away, but the memory of that night clung to me, a shadow that followed me through the hallways. My friends asked about the police cars, their eyes wide with curiosity, but I couldn't find the words to explain the dread that had settled in my chest. Jake tried to lighten the mood, dragging me to the park to play, but every stranger's glance made me flinch, every rustle of leaves a reminder of the doll's curse. Mom's reaction deepened my understanding of her past. She'd grown up in the same town, a witness to the 1963 disappearance, and the doll had reopened old wounds. She told me of the park incident, how the girl's mother had watched a man in a coat smell her daughter's hand, a bizarre act that preceded the abduction. The police had searched for weeks, but the drifter vanished, leaving behind a legend of a child-eating boogeyman. Mom admitted she'd feared the same fate for me, her panic a reflex born of that trauma. She began locking our doors obsessively, checking my room at night, her sleep plagued by nightmares of a shadowed figure climbing through my window. The town's history of petty crime paled next to this. Abductions were rare, but when they happened, they left scars that never faded. The police investigation yielded little. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed security footage from the dentist's house, and canvassed the area where the man had appeared, but no clear suspect emerged. The theory of a copycat gained traction, someone who'd heard the old tale and decided to stir fear, perhaps a teenager with a twisted sense of humor. 2 other children reported receiving similar dolls, their parents joining the panic, but no further incidents occurred, suggesting the police presence had deterred escalation. Still, the lack of closure gnawed at us. Mom refused to let me trick or treat. The next year, her trust in the holiday's innocence destroyed. She'd sit by the window, watching the costumed kids pass, her hands wringing the doll's memory from her mind. I began to wonder about the man myself, his face a blur in my memory, his hat a symbol of the unknown. Was he the original predator, returned after decades, or a new threat mimicking the past? The police dismissed the former, citing the drifter's likely departure, but the latter left a lingering doubt. I started sketching the scene, the hat, the coat, the doll, trying to piece together the puzzle, but each drawing only deepened my unease. Mom noticed my obsession, pulling me into therapy, where a kind counselor helped me process the fear. She taught me breathing exercises, ways to reclaim the night from the doll's shadow, but the questions remained unanswered. The white doll's curse lingered in our home, a silent specter that reshaped our lives, its memory a thread connecting my childhood to a darker past, a past my mother could never fully escape. As months turned to years, the town moved on, the Halloween lockdown fading into a cautionary tale for new generations. I grew older, graduating high school then college, but the doll's image stayed with me, a reminder of vulnerability and the fragility of safety. Mom's fear softened, but she never fully let go, her eyes still scanning crowds during holidays, her hands tightening around mine in crowded places. The 1963 case remained unsolved, its drifter a ghost story that fueled local lore, and my own brush with danger added a personal chapter to that saga. I researched the history myself, digging into old newspapers and talking to Mrs. Henderson, who remembered the missing girl's mother. The park incident had been a turning point. After the man fled, the town had rallied, but the girl's disappearance broke their spirit. No body, no clothes, no trace, just a doll and a whisper of a predator. The police had suspected a drifter, someone passing through, but the copycat theory in my case suggested the legend lived on, perhaps inspiring others. I wondered if the man who gave me the doll had intended harm, or if he'd simply wanted to scare. His act a cruel game that backfired under police scrutiny. The other children with dolls were fine, their stories mirroring mine. No abductions, just fear. The police closed the case, calling it a prank, but the weight of what if haunted us. Mom found peace in church, praying for the missing girl and for me, her faith a shield against the past. I too found solace, writing this story as a way to release the fear, to honor the girl who never came home. The white doll, locked away in evidence, became a symbol, not just of terror, but of resilience, a reminder that we survived its curse. Yet on quiet Halloween nights, I still glance at my door, half expecting a shadow with a hat, a doll in hand, ready to rewrite our story. The Haunted House of Elizabeth Avenue, Kevin's Silent Torment. On the moonlit night of October 30th, 1993. As I stood frozen on Elizabeth Avenue, Kevin emerged from the shadowed moor of the old plantation house, his eyes wild with tears, his voice cracking into a furious scream, "Get the hell away from me!" A transformation so sudden and terrifying, it turned our childhood adventure into a haunting mystery that would haunt me for decades. His face, once so familiar, was twisted with a rage I'd never seen, his hands shoving Toby aside with a violence that left us stunned, his tears glinting like shards of broken glass under the pale light. Kevin, instead of stopping, went from all calm to furiously violent as he shoved Toby off of him and screamed, "Get the hell away from me!" He screamed it so loud, his voice broke like it started as a roar and ended in some kind of squeal, a sound that echoed through the overgrown grass and lodged itself in my memory, a cry of a boy no longer the friend I knew. We were just kids, me, Toby, and Todd, gathered in a dare-driven game, but that moment marked the end of innocence, the beginning of a silence that would stretch across years and end in tragedy. The abandoned house loomed behind him, its tall columns and shuttered windows a silent witness to whatever had shattered Kevin's spirit, a secret he'd carry to his grave, leaving me to wonder what horrors had gripped him in those dark rooms. My name is Chris, and I grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a small town where life revolved around the East Jerusalem Baptist Church that stood between my house and Kevin's. We'd been inseparable since elementary school, part of a tight-knit crew that included Toby from Frederick Street and Todd, whose parents ran a seafood joint on East Hardy Street. Saturday nights were our ritual, wandering the neighborhood, kicking around at the Rebecca Avenue ballpark, or exploring the derelict housing plots near a lawn. But that October night, with Halloween just a day away, we craved something spookier. We tossed around ideas of haunted spots, Vernon D's old place, where a civil rights activist had been murdered by the Klan, or the old train yard and Hattiesburg Cemetery, known for their ghostly tales. But the old plantation house at the end of Elizabeth Avenue caught our attention, its crumbling facade and wraparound veranda screaming for exploration, despite no rumors of hauntings. Maybe that's why it felt like the perfect challenge. We set out after dusk, our boyish bravado fueling us as we crossed Gulfport Street, our voices buzzing with theories about the house's abandonment. Todd suggested the patriarch had gone mad, slaughtering his family in a bloody rampage, while Toby spun a tale of a tragic accident anchoring restless spirits. We laughed it off, knowing none of us really believed it, but the idea of a low-risk adventure lured us in. The house, with its termite-infested walls and sagging roof, looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Its open threshold a black void that dared us to step closer. But as we stood before it, that bravado melted away. None of us wanted to go inside. I remember thinking it looked less spooky in daylight, but at night, with the moon casting long shadows, it felt alive with unseen threats. The tension hung thick as we murmured about its dangers, each of us silently hoping someone else would take the lead. Then Todd, ever the instigator, dared me to go in. I balked, laughing nervously. "Alone? No way, man, you're crazy." Toby got the same dare and refused, but when it landed on Kevin, he paused. A glint of determination in his eyes, he said that he'd go inside, up into a bedroom or down into a basement and bring back something to prove that he'd been there, and in return, he wanted at least half of Todd's candy haul from that following night on Halloween, a bold bargain that stunned us. Todd scoffed, but after some haggling, they settled on a deal. One fistful of candy for every minute Kevin stayed out of sight, plus a souvenir to prove his bravery. We were convinced he'd last maybe 2 or 3 minutes, tops, enough for a quick scare or a laugh. But Kevin's resolve surprised us all. He lit Toby's cigarette lighter, its faint flame flickering as he climbed the creaking porch steps, disappearing into the darkness with a final glance back at Todd, who started, counting the minutes with a thumbs up. The first minute stretched into eternity, the silence from the house amplifying our nerves as we waited for Kevin to emerge, half expecting a scream or a prank that would send us scrambling. I imagined him hiding just inside, stifling laughter. As we grew anxious, but the lack of sound, not a creak, not a whisper, kept us on edge. When the second minute passed, then the third, and still no sign of him, Toby joked nervously, "If he keeps this up, Todd, you won't have any candy left after trick-or-treating tomorrow." Todd's face tightened, realizing 6 handfuls could dent his haul, and by the 5th minute, he marched halfway to the house yelling, "All right, Kevin, you made your point. You got your candy, now come out." We held our breath, expecting Kevin to pop out with a grin, but the house remained silent, its darkness swallowing his presence like a grave. We were a tight crew, bonded by years of shared adventures, bike races down Dent Avenue, sneaking into Taos, Todd's dad's seafood kitchen for fries, or trading comics at the ballpark. Kevin was the quiet one, thoughtful, always ready with a wry smile, but that night something shifted. As the minutes ticked by, 6, 7, 8, Toby's voice trembled as he called Kevin's name, his fear infectious, pulling us closer to the house. By the 10th minute, concern replaced our bravado, and all 3 of us shouted his name, our voices echoing off the rotting walls. Todd, his confidence crumbling, announced he'd go inside to find Kevin, and though Toby and I hesitated, we followed, our footsteps crunching through the grass. The slow, steady footsteps from within sent a chill down my spine, each thud a countdown to something we couldn't name. When Kevin finally stepped into the moonlight, we sighed in relief. He walked fine, no wounds, no blood, just a boy who'd won his candy. Todd snapped, "What the hell, dude? You scared the crap out of us." I waited for Kevin's laugh, his victory lap, but instead, he brushed past us, heading down Elizabeth Avenue without a word. "Kevin, where you going, dude?" we called, but he kept walking, his tears glistening, his silence deafening. Toby and I ran ahead, blocking his path, pleading, "What happened in there?" That's when I saw the tears, the raw pain in his eyes, and before we could react, he shoved Toby, screaming again, "Get the hell away from me!" His voice broke into a squeal, a sound so alien it froze us in place. Kevin's scream lingered in the air, a jagged wound in the fabric of our friendship. His wild eyes and trembling hands, a stark contrast to the boy who'd laughed with us just hours before. A mystery born in that house that would haunt us forever. We stood stunned, watching him storm off toward his home, his footsteps heavy with a burden we couldn't fathom. Todd scrambled to his feet, and we followed at a distance, calling after him, begging him to stop, to explain. But Kevin ignored us, his silence a wall we couldn't breach, his tears a sign of a terror he wouldn't share. It was as if the house had stolen his voice, replacing it with a rage that turned him into a stranger. We reached his street, saw him disappear into his house, and retreated, shaken, to Toby's and Todd's homes, too scared to follow further, fearing his next outburst might turn physical again. The next day, Halloween, was supposed to be our triumph, trick-or-treating with bags overflowing with candy. I called Kevin's house, hoping to hear his voice, but his mom answered, calm at first, saying he was under the weather and napping. I pressed, asking if he'd acted strange last night, and her pause told me more than her words. She was covering for him, her tone strained as she insisted he was fine. No call came, and a second attempt revealed he wouldn't join us. A blow. That stung deeper than missing candy. Todd and Toby felt it too. Kevin missing trick-or-treating was unthinkable, a sign something was terribly wrong. We pooled our candy, heading to his house to check on him, but his mom barred the door, saying he was too sick for visitors. For a week he stayed sick, a vague excuse that fueled our worry. I couldn't shake the image of Kevin's face, his tears, his scream. a puzzle piece that didn't fit our carefree world. When I finally reached him on the phone, I asked about the house, desperate for answers. His response was a cold threat. "If you ever ask about it again, I won't be your friend anymore." I bit my tongue, respecting his wish, but the damage was done. Kevin wasn't the same. His laughter faded, his presence distant. Todd and Toby faced the same silence, and we all avoided Elizabeth Avenue, too afraid to uncover what had changed him. 6 months later, the house was demolished, a final chance to investigate lost. And I never broke my promise, fearing I'd lose him entirely. The demolition of the Elizabeth Avenue house marked the end of a chapter, its rubble a silent grave. For Kevin's secret, a burden that followed him to Jacksonville and into the shadows of addiction, ending in a heroin overdose before he turned 40. Years later, I learned of his death through mutual friends, a shock that hit harder when I heard he'd struggled with addiction, begging strangers for money but never us. At his funeral, I met his Narcotics Anonymous sponsor, a man who'd known Kevin's final years, and I asked the one question that had gnawed at me for decades. Had Kevin ever mentioned that night? The sponsor shook his head. No hint, no clue, despite their deep talks about his past. I cried, not for the unanswered secret, but for the weight Kevin had carried alone, a weight that might have killed him. Kevin's move to Jacksonville with his mum, seeking her parents' support, severed our bond. We tried calling, inviting him back, but his lackluster responses faded into silence, a hint we eventually heeded. I found a Facebook profile under his name, no photo, and sent a friend request that went unanswered, a ghost of the friend I'd lost. His addiction, hidden from us, painted a tragic picture of a boy changed by that house, a change we'd never understand. The sponsor's stories of Kevin's struggles, his pleas for cash, his isolation, suggested the house's impact lingered, a trauma he buried deep. The question of what he saw that night remains, a whisper in the wind, a mystery that ties his death to that abandoned ruin. I often wonder if returning to Hattiesburg, facing that past, might have saved him. The house's demolition erased the physical evidence, but not the emotional scars. Kevin's silence protected a secret that cost him his life, a lesson in the power of unspoken fears. Rest in peace, Kev. I miss you, and I hope you found peace beyond that haunted threshold. The abduction of Nima, a parent's unanswered grief. The suffocating heat of an abandoned house 4 blocks from her family home in Lawton, Oklahoma. A group of school children flung open a rusted refrigerator door, only to recoil in horror, as the decomposing body of 19-month-old Nima Louise Carter stared back, her tiny form curled in a silent scream, a tragic end to a nightmare that began on Halloween night 1977. The air turned thick with the stench of decay, the children's cries echoing through the dilapidated kitchen as they stumbled back, their innocence shattered by the grim discovery. Lying on one of the fridge's bare glass shelves was the suffocated, decomposing body of little Nima. Carter Elton has always been something of a rough and ready place, and was no stranger to petty and sometimes violent crime. But the abduction of children in the middle of the night was unheard of, or at least almost unheard of, a reality that made Nima's fate all the more chilling. Her parents, George and Rose Carter, had kissed her goodnight just hours before, unaware that a predator lurked in their midst, snatching her from her crib in the dead of night. That refrigerator, a cold tomb in a forgotten house, became the final chapter of her story, a wound that would never heal for a town or a family, left to grapple with unanswered questions and a grief that cut deeper than words. Lawton, a city of nearly 990,000, nestled on former Comanche and Apache lands, was a place of rolling plains and the rugged Wichita Mountains, its economy bolstered by Fort Sill and a mix of education, healthcare, and manufacturing. George Carter worked in the latter, a hard-working man who dreamed of a safe life for his young family. On October 31st, 1977, Halloween night, The Carters followed their routine, laying Nima in her crib with tender kisses, her soft coos a lullaby, in the quiet house. They retired to their bedroom, exhausted from the day, expecting a peaceful sleep, only to wake to a nightmare that would redefine their lives. The next morning, Nima's crib was empty, her absence a void that sucked the breath from their lungs. George's heart raced, fearing a heart attack, while Rose tore through the house, kitchen cabinets, closets, even the doghouse, her panic a desperate plea to undo the unthinkable. The police arrived, their faces grim, beginning a search that would uncover a horror beyond imagination. The investigation started with the basics. How had the abductor entered? Nima's bedroom windows were locked. No signs of forced entry marred the doors, leaving a chilling conclusion. The intruder had slipped in during daylight, hiding in the closet until the house fell silent, then carried Nima out without a sound. The community reeled, posters of Nima's smiling face plastered across Lawton, pleas for information ringing out as police urged vigilance against suspicious activity. The idea of a 19-month-old being targeted seemed incomprehensible, yet hope clung to the belief she was alive, perhaps held for ransom or transport. But that hope was shattered a month later, when those children stumbled upon her remains, a discovery that turned a town's hope into despair. The refrigerator door's creak still echoes in my mind, a sound that marked the end of Nima's life and the beginning of a parent's unending sorrow. The Carters' world collapsed that morning. George later recalled the crisp Oklahoma air, a day he might have enjoyed under different circumstances, now tainted by the loss of his daughter. Rose's frantic search, checking irrational places, reflected a mother's refusal to accept the truth, her love driving her to madness. The police, initially suspecting parental involvement, a common thread in missing child cases, cleared George and Rose after lie detector tests, their innocence a small consolation in a sea of grief. Suspicion then turned outward, to neighbors and babysitters, but the focus soon narrowed to Jacqueline Rubido, a young woman with a troubling past. The discovery of Nima's body sent shockwaves through Lawton, her tiny form in that refrigerator, a grim testament to a predator's cruelty, a wound that deepened when investigators linked her abduction to Jacqueline Rubido, a babysitter with a shadow over her name from a near-identical crime the year before. The community's fear grew palpable, parents arming themselves with guns and locks, bars on windows a new norm as whispers of a child snatcher spread. Jacqueline, a 16-year-old Native American, had been implicated in the 1976 abduction of twin sisters Mary and Tina Carpenter. A friend had lured the 3-year-olds outside, where Jacqueline dragged them away, their cries ignored until police arrived too late. Tina survived 2 days in a refrigerator, rescued by children hearing her. Weak groans, but Mary perished, a victim of prolonged asphyxiation. Jacqueline was released due to lack of evidence, her quiet demeanor masking a potential threat. And by 1977, she was a regular babysitter for the Carters, trusted with Nima. The Carter home, a modest dwelling on Lawton's Plains, became a crime scene. Detective Cecil Davidson and his team scoured it, finding no forced entry, reinforcing the theory of a hidden intruder. George and Rose were devastated, their initial joy at Nima's giggles replaced by a hollow ache. The police questioned them, a routine suspicion in such cases, but their passing lie detector tests shifted focus. Jacqueline emerged as a suspect. When someone recalled her prior involvement, her presence in the Carter home on Halloween night raising red flags, Davidson confronted her, her evasive answers, claiming she was playing bingo, fueling his belief in her guilt, though no physical evidence tied her to the crime. The Carpenter twins case haunted the investigation. Tina's survival, cramped in a refrigerator near railroad tracks, mirrored Nima's fate, suggesting a pattern. Jacqueline's nickname, Jackie Boo, slipped from Tina's lips, pointing to her, yet without fingerprints or blood. The case stalled. The Carter's dog, poisoned months before, and a vandalized home added to the suspicion. But George struggled to reconcile the Jacqueline he knew, whom Nima hugged, with a murderer. Rose's death in 2000 left George alone with his grief, his church a refuge, his what-ifs a daily torment. The image of Nima's crib, empty under the morning light, still burns in George's memory. A silent accusation of a night they didn't check on her. The town's rough edge, accustomed to petty crime, was unprepared for this. Children were. Kept indoors, parents vigilant, but the lack of closure fueled rumors. Davidson's conviction of Jacqueline's guilt clashed with the district attorney's caution, leaving the case unresolved. The refrigerator, a cold grave, became a symbol of lost innocence, its discovery a moment that redefined Lawton's safety. The refrigerator's grim secret exposed Jacqueline Rubido's potential darkness, her quiet presence a mask for a soul that might have stolen Nima from her crib, a crime that left George Carter to wrestle with a grief that time could only dull, not erase. The community's fear lingered, a palpable tension that turned Halloween into a night of locked doors and whispered warnings. George, now an active church member, found solace in prayer, but the unanswered questions, why Nima, why that night, burned within him. Rose's frantic search that morning, checking every corner, reflected a mother's desperate hope, a hope crushed by the refrigerator's revelation. The police's initial focus on the parents, a standard protocol, cleared them, but the lack of evidence against Jacqueline left a void of justice. The Carpenter case offered a chilling parallel. Tina's survival, her twins' death, pointed to Jacqueline's method, using refrigerators as tombs, a tactic repeated with Nima. Witnesses' phone calls during the twins' abduction, their cries ignored, mirrored the silent theft of Nima, suggesting a predator comfortable in the shadows. Davidson's interrogation of Jacqueline revealed her evasiveness, her gaze averted, her bingo alibi crumbling under scrutiny. He believed her anger at babysitting, missing bingo nights, drove her to act, but without a confession or physical proof, the case faltered. The district attorney's reluctance to prosecute, fearing a weak case, left Davidson lamenting a missed opportunity, his conviction unproven but unshaken. George's memories of Jacqueline clashed with the suspect she became. Nima's hugs for her babysitter painted a picture of trust, yet the poisoned dog and vandalism hinted at a deeper malice. An interview years later revealed Jacqueline's drug use during that time, a confession that fueled George's suspicion of someone familiar, but doubt lingered. Rose's death left him alone, his pain a quiet storm, his church a haven where he sought peace. The what-ifs haunted him. What if they'd checked Nima's closet? What if they'd brought her to their bed? A litany of regret that echoed in every silent night. The town moved on, but the scar remained. Children's laughter faded. From parks replaced by vigilance, the refrigerator's image a ghost in local lore. Davidson's belief in Jacqueline's guilt, shared by some, divided opinions, but without closure, Lawton lived with a shadow. George's poetic lament, unanswered questions still burn within, captured a father's enduring pain, a pain that shaped his faith and his fight for memory. The refrigerator's cold embrace of Nima's body became a symbol of a town's lost innocence, a grief that bound George Carter to a past he couldn't escape, a past where Jacqueline Rubido's shadow loomed, unanswered and unresolved. Years after Rose's death, George found a fragile peace in his church, his sermons a quiet tribute to Nima, but the pain never fully lifted. The 1976 Carpenter case, with Tina's survival and Mary's death, offered a blueprint for Nima's fate, yet Jacqueline's release without charge left a wound that festered. The lack of physical evidence, fingerprints, hair, blood, frustrated Davidson. His belief in her guilt, a solitary conviction against the district attorney's caution. George's reflections grew deeper with time. The poisoned dog, the vandalism, Jacqueline's drug confession, all pointed to a familiar threat, yet his heart resisted blaming her fully. Nima's cries that night, ignored to avoid spoiling her, became a regret that gnawed at him, a what-if that replayed in his dreams. The community's fear, their locked windows and guns faded as years passed. But the story of the refrigerator lingered, a cautionary tale for new generations. The image of Nima's crib, empty under the morning sun, still pierces George's soul, a silent cry for justice he'll never see. Nima's abduction reshaped Lawton, her name a whisper of loss. No one was charged, Jacqueline's quiet life an enigma, and George's grief a testament to a parent's love. The refrigerator, a cold tomb, stands in memory as a warning of trust betrayed, of innocence stolen, and of questions that burn eternal.